Over the Rhine had 36 breweries inside 1 square mile in 1880. The Miami and Erie Canal cut through the south end of the neighborhood, and the Germans who lived above it called the canal the Rhine. 75% of the people on those streets had been born in Bavaria, Hanover, or Prussia. They ate goetta for breakfast and mock turtle soup for supper. Number 17 sold from a tin pail on a wooden cart for 5 cents. Number 9 sat free on every saloon counter from Vine Street to Liberty. Number 3 took 4 days to prepare. These 25 meals were not novelty. They were the daily food of a German city inside an American one. Subscribe and sit at the table. Here are 25 forgotten meals German immigrants actually ate in 1880s Cincinnati. Number 25. Sunday Sauerbraten Plate. The roast went into the crock on Wednesday night. Vinegar, red wine, peppercorns, juniper berries, bay leaves, sliced onion, and a strip of orange peel. The cook turned it twice a day for 4 days. By Sunday morning, the beef was the color of mahogany and the kitchen smelled of cloves and gingerbread. Oma served it with potato dumplings and red cabbage cooked in the same vinegar bath. The gravy was thickened with crushed Lebkuchen, the spice cookies left over from Christmas. Nothing was wasted. A family in Over the Rhine could feed 8 people from a 4-pound roast that cost 60 cents at the Findlay Market Butcher. The meal lasted 3 hours at the table. Children sat on the same chairs their parents had carried over from Bremen. The thing about a Sunday Sauerbraten was that it did not work without time. You could not rush it. You could not buy it on the way home. It was a meal that asked the cook to think 4 days ahead, and that was the whole point. Number 24, goetta. A pound of pork shoulder, a pound of beef chuck, 2 cups of pinhead oats, 1 onion, salt, pepper, bay. It simmered for 3 hours on a coal stove until the oats fell apart and the meat shredded. The cook poured it into a loaf pan and set it in the cellar overnight. By morning, it was firm enough to slice. A skillet, a knob of lard, a hot pan, and the goetta crisped on both sides until the edges turned the color of dark rye. Workers carried it in tin pails to the breweries on McMicken Avenue. It was peasant food from Oldenburg and Hanover, the regions most Cincinnati Germans had come from. The dish stretched a half-pound of meat into 8 breakfasts. That was the simple math of an immigrant kitchen. Cheap, filling, honest. Number 23, mock turtle soup. There were no turtles in the soup. There never had been. The Hanover Germans who landed in Cincinnati had once eaten real turtle soup at home. In Ohio, they had no turtles, so they used the head of a calf instead. The skin and gristle gave the broth its strange jelly texture. The cook added hard-boiled eggs, ketchup, lemon juice, sherry, and ground cloves. The result tasted like nothing else on the river. Rich, dark, faintly sweet. Cincinnati housewives kept jars of mock turtle in their pantries the way other Americans kept tomato preserves. It became so common that by the 1880s, every German tavern from Liberty to Findlay served it on Saturdays. The soup outlived the people who invented it. That is the strange thing about immigrant food. The recipe survives even when the language does not. Number 22, Schmierkäse on rye. Schmierkäse was the German name for what Pennsylvania farmers called cottage cheese. The Cincinnati version was different. It was drier, crumblier, and the cook seasoned it with caraway and chopped chives from the backyard. Spread thick on a slice of dark rye, topped with a thin slice of raw onion, eaten with a glass of beer at noon. That was lunch for half the men working at the Christian Moorline bottling plant on Elm Street. The cheese cost 2 cents. The bread cost 3. A pail of beer cost a nickel. For 10 cents, a man fed himself for a full afternoon shift. Schmierkäse did not travel well. It went sour in a day. So families ate it the morning it was made and started a new batch the next night. Year after year, the same small ritual. Number 21, Schwartenmagen. The American name was head cheese. The German name meant skin stomach. It was made from the parts of the pig nobody wanted to eat plain. Cheek meat, snout, tongue, ears, jowls, and a long simmer in stock until the gelatin pulled everything together. The cook poured the mixture into a casing or a loaf pan and weighted it down overnight. By morning, it was firm enough to slice into translucent pink and gray rounds. Eckerlin Meats at Findlay Market sold Schwartenmagen by the half-pound starting in 1855. A German butcher named Ernie Eckerlin had brought the recipe from Baden. His grandson still made it 80 years later. The slice went on dark rye with mustard and a pickled cucumber. It cost almost nothing. A whole family ate from a single loaf for 3 days. That kind of math kept poor immigrants alive. Number 20, hot slaw with metwurst. This was not the cold mayonnaise dish you know now. The cabbage was shredded fine, then dressed in a hot pan with bacon fat, vinegar, sugar, mustard seed, and a pinch of caraway. The cook served it warm under 2 fat smoked sausages, the metwurst from the German butcher on Vine Street. The fat from the sausage melted into the cabbage. The vinegar cut the richness. Every bite was sour, sweet, salty, smoky, all at once. Pennsylvania Dutch families had been making this dish since the 1700s, and the Cincinnati Germans adopted it because it stretched 2 sausages into a meal for 4. Hot slaw was Sunday supper after a long week at the brewery. Plain food, real food, the kind that filled a working man before he walked back to a coal stove apartment. Number 19, pickled pig's feet. A jar of pickled pig's feet sat on every saloon bar in Over the Rhine in 1880. The free lunch counter was a tradition the German barkeeps had carried from Bavaria, where a tavern was supposed to feed you if you bought beer. The feet were boiled with vinegar, peppercorns, bay, and a sliced onion, then packed in jars and left to cure for a week. The meat came off the bone in soft, tangy strips, salty enough to make a man drink 3 more steins. That was the point. The free lunch was not generosity, it was strategy. But the customer did not care. He had walked 12 hours in the slaughterhouse and his feet hurt, and the jar was free. He ate 2 and ordered another beer. The arrangement worked for both sides. Number 18, Leber noodle soup. Liver dumplings in clear broth. The cook ground beef liver fine, mixed it with day-old bread soaked in milk, marjoram, parsley, a beaten egg, salt, and pepper. She rolled the mixture into balls the size of walnuts and dropped them into simmering beef stock. 20 minutes later, the dumplings floated to the top, dense and savory and deeply rich. A bowl of Leberknödel was Sunday supper for the Bavarian families clustered around Race Street. It was also church supper food at the Lutheran congregation on 15th, where the women cooked in shifts every 4th Sunday for 200 parishioners. Now, here is the thing about Leberknödel. The meal cost almost nothing because liver was the cheapest cut at Findlay Market, but the broth that surrounded it was the most expensive part of cooking, the slow fire, the bones that simmered 8 hours, the patience of a cook who refused to rush a soup. That was the unspoken rule of every immigrant kitchen on the canal. Time was the one thing the poor had more of than the rich, and time was what made the food taste like home. A grandmother could not afford imported wine or fresh oysters. She could afford to stand at a stove for 9 hours on a Saturday and skim the foam off a stockpot every 20 minutes until the broth turned amber. That was her wealth. The dumplings were the proof. Number 17, Wiener Wurst from the cart. The Wiener Wurst man was a famous figure in 1880s Cincinnati. Henry Farney sketched him in the streets for the Illustrated Cincinnati Guide. He pushed a tin cart down Vine Street with a brass kettle of hot water and a basket of split rolls, and he sold Wiener sausages for 5 cents apiece. The sausage was the Frankfurt style, smoked beef and pork, snappy in the casing. The roll was a torpedo of dark rye. The mustard was sharp German brown. Boys on the way home from the Eckerlin slaughterhouse on Liberty Street stopped at his cart for supper. The whole transaction took 12 seconds. The man wiped the same knife he had used since 1872. Nothing about it was clean by modern standards. Nothing about it needed to be. People ate from his cart for 40 years and remembered the taste their whole lives. Number 16, salt rising bread. This was the loaf that did not use yeast. The starter came from cornmeal, milk, sugar, and a pinch of baking soda left to ferment overnight in a warm place near the stove. By morning, the mixture had risen on its own, leavened by wild bacteria. The bread that came out of the oven the next day was dense, faintly cheesy, and smelled like nothing else in the kitchen. Some people loved it. Some people hated the smell. German immigrants had brought the technique from the Hanover countryside, where commercial yeast was a city luxury, and farm wives had to invent their own leavening. Salt-rising bread kept for a week without molding. It made the best toast a working man ever ate, crisp on the outside, soft and slightly tangy in the middle, eaten with a slab of cold butter and a cup of black coffee at 5 in the morning before the walk to the brewery. Number 15, Metwurst sandwich. Metwurst was the soft, spreadable smoked sausage the Hanover Germans had carried with them across the Atlantic. It came in a casing the size of a small banana, deep red, almost the texture of pâté. The cook sliced the casing open and spread the soft meat on a thick slab of pumpernickel. A swipe of butter, a dab of mustard, a pickle on the side. That was the lunch most German laborers in Over the Rhine carried in their tin pails. It cost about 4 cents. It kept for hours without refrigeration. The Metwurst at Eckerlin Meats was made from a 100-year-old recipe that the family still guards today. Some traditions cross the ocean. Some die at customs. This one survived both. Number 14, Spätzle and brown gravy. Spätzle were the small, irregular egg noodles from Swabia. The cook mixed flour, eggs, milk, salt, and nutmeg into a wet dough, then pressed it through a colander or scraped it off a wooden board into a pot of boiling water. The noodles cooked in 2 minutes, floated to the surface, and went straight into a hot skillet with butter and the brown drippings from a pot roast. The result was rich, chewy, faintly eggy, and deeply satisfying after a 12-hour shift at the Cooperative. Spätzle were considered a Sunday side in Bavaria, but in Cincinnati they became a weeknight staple because they used what was already in the kitchen: 3 eggs, a cup of flour, leftover gravy, dinner. Now here is what most people miss about an immigrant kitchen. The simplest food was almost always the most clever because somebody had thought through every step a generation before. A grandmother in Stuttgart had figured out the right ratio of egg to flour by feel alone, and her granddaughter in Cincinnati was still using the same ratio in 1880, and the food was still working. Tradition is not romance. Tradition is a successful experiment that nobody bothered to write down. The Cincinnati Germans cooked with that kind of inheritance every night, and they did not call it heritage. They called it dinner. The pot was always on. The noodles were always good. Children learned how to make them by watching, the way they learned to walk. By the time a girl was 12, she could feed a table of 7 without measuring a thing. That was a kind of wealth, too. Number 13, Kartoffelsalat. The German potato salad of Cincinnati was warm, not cold. The cook boiled waxy potatoes in their skins, peeled them while still hot, sliced them thin, and dressed them in a hot bath of bacon fat, cider vinegar, sugar, salt, mustard, and chopped onion. No mayonnaise. The dressing soaked into the warm potatoes and made each slice glossy and savory. It was served with bratwurst, with smoked pork chops, with a fried egg on top for breakfast the next day. Bavarian families ate it at every church picnic. The recipe traveled from village to village because it required nothing fancy. A pound of potatoes, 4 strips of bacon, a glug of vinegar, and a sharp onion. That was the whole list. Kartoffelsalat is still the Cincinnati German side dish at Oktoberfest 140 years later. Some recipes simply work. Number 12, soused herring. The herring came in barrels from the North Sea ports, packed in salt for the Atlantic crossing. The German fishmonger at Findlay Market sold them out of a wooden tub for 2 cents apiece. The cook soaked the herring overnight to draw out the salt, then layered them in a crock with sliced onion, bay leaves, peppercorns, and a brine of cider vinegar and sugar. After 3 days, the fish was ready. Pickled, soft, tangy, faintly sweet. A family in a 3rd-floor apartment on Republic Street ate soused herring on dark rye for supper twice a week. It cost almost nothing and lasted in the crock for a month. Most American Cincinnatians thought soused herring was strange. The Germans thought it was the taste of home. Number 11, bratwurst with sauerkraut. The bratwurst was made fresh at the butcher every morning. Pork shoulder, white pepper, marjoram, nutmeg, and a casing from the gut of a hog. The sauerkraut had been fermenting in a stoneware crock in the cellar for 6 weeks. The cook drained the kraut, squeezed it dry, and simmered it in beer with a sliced onion and a few juniper berries. She browned the brats in a cast-iron skillet and finished them on top of the kraut. The whole pan went to the table with mustard and a loaf of pumpernickel. This was the German immigrant Saturday supper. Plain, honest, filling. The kind of food a man could eat after a hard day and still wake up at 5 the next morning ready to walk back to the brewery. Number 10. Hand cheese with onion. Handkäse mit Musik, hand cheese with music. The music was the raw onion that played in your stomach later. The cheese itself was a small, round, pungent disc made from soured milk and aged for 2 weeks until it turned translucent in the middle. The cook placed it on a plate, drizzled it with vinegar and oil, scattered raw onion and a pinch of caraway over the top, and served it with dark bread and a stein of lager. It was a working man's snack at Wielert's Beer Garden on Vine Street, where Heinrich Wielert had opened his beer hall in 1873 and a 40-piece orchestra played under a glass dome. A nickel bought a man a beer and a plate of hand cheese, and he could sit there for 2 hours and pretend the noise of the city was a Bavarian village instead. Number 9. Saloon-free lunch. Every saloon in Over the Rhine in 1880 had a free lunch counter. Pretzels, rye bread, smoked herring, salted peanuts, dill pickles, and a tray of cold cuts that included Blutwurst, Zervalatwurst, and Landjäger. The salt was deliberate. The salt made men drink more beer. The barkeep gave you the food for nothing because he knew you would buy 3 steins to wash it down. The whole arrangement was an honest deal between a thirsty man and a smart innkeeper. Now here's the thing about the free lunch that most people miss. It was the closest thing to a public cafeteria the working class had in 1880s Cincinnati. A laborer could walk into a saloon at noon, drop a nickel for a beer, and eat a plate of cured meats and rye bread that would have cost him 15 cents at a restaurant. He could read the German newspaper hanging from a wooden rod on the wall. He could argue politics with the man next to him in his own dialect. He could disappear from his life for 1 full hour, and nobody at home would know. That hour was worth more than the beer and the bread combined. A free lunch was the whole working-class theater of an immigrant city, played out 100 times a day on every block from Liberty Street up to Findlay. The men who sat at those bars were the same men who poured the bricks of those bars, who built the breweries that brewed the beer, who filled the sausages that were stacked on the trays. Everything in the room had been made by somebody in the room. The barkeep knew every customer by name. The customer knew which sausage came from which butcher on which street. That was a kind of dignity the modern saloon has never replaced, because the modern saloon is not made by the people who drink in it. The Cincinnati German saloon was. Every brick, every loaf, every man. Number 8. Apfelstrudel. The strudel dough was the test of a German baker. She rolled it on a flour-dusted tablecloth, then pulled it with the backs of her hands until it was thin enough to read a newspaper through. Onto that paper-thin sheet went sliced apples, raisins, sugar, cinnamon, breadcrumbs toasted in butter, and a handful of chopped walnuts. The cook rolled the strudel like a long log, slid it onto a buttered baking sheet, and brushed the top with melted butter every 10 minutes while it baked. The result came out the color of dark honey, crackling on the outside, soft and tart and sweet inside. Cincinnati Germans ate Apfelstrudel on Sunday afternoons with strong black coffee. A pan fed 12 people for 15 cents in apples and butter. Even the poorest household made it once a month, because dessert was not a luxury in a German kitchen. Dessert was the proof you had survived another week. Number 7. Springerl cookies. These were the carved Christmas cookies the German bakeries pressed with wooden molds. Lambs, deer, angels, hearts, ships, and roses. The dough was anise-flavored, made from sugar, eggs, flour, and ammonium carbonate, an old leavening that gave the cookies their hollow snap. The cook rolled the dough thin, pressed it with the carved mold, cut around the picture, and let the cookies sit overnight to dry. They baked the next morning on parchment until the bottoms were pale gold and the tops still white. The picture stayed sharp because the dough had set before the heat hit it. Springerle kept for 3 months in a tin in the pantry. Children were given one as a Christmas gift, and the family ate the rest slowly all the way through January. A simple cookie, a small treasure, the kind of thing that turned a poor immigrant winter into a holiday. Number 6. Lebkuchen, the German gingerbread of Christmas. The recipe came from Nuremberg, where the bakers had been making it since the 1300s. The dough was honey, flour, brown sugar, candied citrus peel, ground almonds, cinnamon, cloves, mace, and a pinch of black pepper. The cook baked it on rounds of edible wafer paper to keep it from sticking and brushed the tops with a sugar glaze while still warm. Lebkuchen was the cookie that fed the church bake sale at Old St. Mary's on 13th Street, the German Catholic parish in Over the Rhine. It was also the cookie that thickened next year's Sunday sauerbraten gravy when the leftovers went stale. Nothing in a German immigrant kitchen ever went into the trash. A stale Lebkuchen was a future ingredient. That was a basic, plain truth of frugal cooking that has been forgotten by almost every American kitchen since. Number 5. Pumpernickel and butter, the black bread of Westphalia. It was steamed in a covered pan for 20 hours instead of baked, which is what gave it the dark color and the dense, almost wet texture. The German bakeries on Vine Street made it once a week, on Mondays, and a single loaf weighed 3 pounds and lasted a family until Friday. The cook sliced it thin, spread it with cold butter, and topped it with a curl of metwurst or a slice of hand cheese. That was breakfast. That was supper. That was the railroad workers' pail at noon. A loaf cost 6 cents. It fueled the men who paved the streets of Cincinnati and laid the rails into the freight yards along the canal. There was nothing fancy about pumpernickel. There never had been. The bread had been peasant food for 600 years, and the immigrants who made it in 1880 were the great-grandchildren of the people who had invented it. They were not embarrassed by it. They were proud of it. The bread was them. Number 4. Bee sting cake, Bienenstich. A yeast dough pressed flat into a pan, topped with a sticky almond and honey caramel, baked until the top was the color of caramelized brown sugar, then split horizontally and filled with a thick vanilla custard. The Bavarian bakery on Ray Street made it on Saturdays, and it sold out by noon. A whole cake cost 15 cents and fed 8 people. Children stood at the bakery window and watched the baker slide the trays out of the oven. The honey topping cracked when you bit into it. The custard inside was cold and rich and smelled faintly of lemon zest. Now here is the part that surprised me when I read about it. The cake had a folk story attached. The legend said a baker in a Rhineland village had thrown honey at thieves trying to break into his shop, and the thieves had stung the honey by accident and dropped it on his oven, and the resulting cake had won him a contest. Probably none of that was true. But the German bakers in Cincinnati told the story to their American customers anyway, because every immigrant food in 1880 carried a folk tale across the ocean with it. The story was as much the recipe as the flour and butter. That was how a culture survived in a new city. Not just through ingredients, but through the small, repeated lies that kept the past alive at the kitchen table. Number 3. Blutwurst on rye, blood sausage. Most modern Americans recoil at the name. The Cincinnati Germans of 1880 did not. Blutwurst was made from pork, fat, onion, allspice, marjoram, and fresh pig blood from the slaughterhouse on Liberty Street, all stuffed into a long casing and slowly poached until firm. The cook sliced it thick and pan-fried it until the outside crisped and the inside turned a deep, almost purple brown. It went on dark rye with hot mustard and a slice of pickled apple. The taste was iron-rich, faintly sweet, almost mineral. Workers ate blutwurst for breakfast at the Findlay Market lunch counter. It was 8 cents for a whole sausage. It fed a man through a 10-hour day on the brewery floor. The dish has almost vanished from American kitchens. It survives only in a few old German butchers in Cincinnati and Milwaukee, and the people who make it now are usually the great-grandchildren of the people who first made it on this continent. Number 2. Dampfnudeln, steamed dumplings the size of a baby's fist. The cook made a yeast dough, let it rise twice, formed it into balls, and dropped them into a heavy pot with a half inch of milk, butter, and salt. She covered the pot tightly and let the Dampfnudeln steam for 30 minutes. The bottoms turned a dark golden crust because the milk burned away in the last few minutes and the butter fried the bottoms instead. The tops stayed soft and pillowy. Sweet versions came with vanilla sauce and stewed plums. Savory versions sat next to a bowl of beef stew. The dish came from the Palatinate, the Rhineland-Pfalz, and the families who had emigrated from there to Cincinnati in the 1860s and 1870s kept making it without changing a thing. A pot of Dampfnudeln was a Sunday afternoon in a third-floor walk-up, the windows fogged from steam, the smell of bread and butter and burnt milk filling 4 rooms. Number 1. Sunday Supper at the Turner Hall. The Cincinnati Turngemeinde was the first Turner Society in America, organized in 1848. By the 1880s, it had a handsome building on Walnut Street with a gymnasium upstairs and a dining hall downstairs. On Sunday nights, the German immigrant families of over the Rhine walked there in their best clothes for the community supper. Long oak tables, white tablecloths, beer steins down the middle. The meal was sauerbraten with potato dumplings, hot slaw, dark rye, butter, pickles, soused herring, and bee sting cake. The women cooked in shifts. The men poured the lager from kegs Christian Moerlein had sent over for free. Children ran between the tables. Old men argued in 3 different German dialects about the news from the Heimat. The Turner supper was not a meal. It was a country, folded into one room. By 1918, most of the dialects were gone. The Turner halls had quietly removed their German signs. The food got anglicized, then forgotten. But on a Sunday night in 1882, in a brick hall on Walnut Street, 1,000 German immigrants ate supper together and felt, for 3 hours, like they had never left home. That is the meal that all the others on this list were practiced for. Here is what these 25 meals were when you put them on the same table. They were a city inside a city, a language spoken with a fork. The way an immigrant generation kept its dignity in a country that would, 30 years later, ask them to anglicize their names. The food survived the wars. The food did not always survive the grandchildren who stopped speaking German in 1943. Tell me in the comments which dish your Oma still makes, or which one died with her. These meals were never just supper. They were a way to say, I am still here.